December 7, 1941. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto watches his pilots return from Pearl Harbor. The attack was a stunning success. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, over 2,400 Americans dead, the Pacific Fleet crippled. His officers are celebrating. Japan has delivered a knockout blow to American naval power, but Yamamoto isn't celebrating. He's staring at a map of the Pacific, doing calculations in his head. Someone asks him if he thinks Japan can win the war. His response would prove prophetic. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." 3 years and 8 months later, a Japanese soldier named Yasuo Kuwahara sits in a cave on Okinawa, listening to the sound that has haunted him for weeks, the thunder of American naval guns. Day and night, relentless, unstoppable. "We called it the Steel Typhoon," he would write after the war. "It never slept, it never stopped, and it was coming for us." This is the story of why Japanese soldiers came to fear the U.S. Navy more than any other force in World War II. Not the Soviet Army, not the British, not even the atomic bomb. The U.S. Navy became the embodiment of industrial warfare, a force so overwhelming that Japanese soldiers knew with absolute certainty that defeat was inevitable once they heard those ships on the horizon. In 1941, Japan had one of the world's most powerful navies. The Imperial Japanese Navy had aircraft carriers, battleships like the massive Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built, elite naval aviators, and the Long Lance torpedo, the most advanced naval torpedo in the world. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, elite training, and decisive battle. They had good reason for confidence. In the opening months of the Pacific War, the Japanese Navy seemed unstoppable. After Pearl Harbor, they sank the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya. They conquered the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and swept across the Pacific. Within 6 months, Japan controlled an empire stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. But there were ominous signs from the beginning. At Pearl Harbor, the attack had missed its most important targets. America's 3 aircraft carriers were at sea that day. And crucially, the Japanese had failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks and repair facilities. The harbor could be rebuilt. The fleet could be repaired. More importantly, the attack had done exactly what Yamamoto feared. It unified America. Before Pearl Harbor, America was divided about entering the war. After Pearl Harbor, the nation was united in fury. And that fury would be channeled into the most massive naval construction program in human history. Here's what Japanese planners hadn't fully understood about America: its industrial capacity. In 1941, the United States produced more steel than Japan, Germany, and Italy combined. It had more shipyards, more trained workers, more resources, and more industrial infrastructure than any nation on Earth. The numbers are staggering. In the entire war, Japan built 17 aircraft carriers of all types. The United States built 141. Japan built 63 destroyers. America built 349. Japan built 126 submarines. America built 203. But even those numbers don't capture the true scale of American production. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards launched an Essex-class aircraft carrier every 2 months on average. Every week, a new destroyer. The Kaiser shipyards in California were building Liberty ships, cargo vessels, in an average of 42 days. One ship, the Robert E. Peary, was built in just 4 days and 15 hours as a demonstration of American industrial capacity. Japanese naval officers began to realize they were in a race they couldn't win. Every ship they lost was irreplaceable. Every pilot killed represented years of training that couldn't be replicated. Meanwhile, America was churning out ships, planes and trained personnel at a rate that seemed impossible. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was the turning point. Japanese forces had achieved an unbroken string of victories. They believed their carrier forces were invincible, their pilots superior, their tactics unbeatable. Midway would demonstrate their dominance and force America to negotiate. Instead, in one day, June 4, 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air groups. The U.S. lost 1 carrier. It was a catastrophic reversal. More importantly, it showed Japanese naval aviators that they weren't invincible, that American forces could outfight them, and that luck could turn in an instant. But Midway was just the beginning. What followed was a methodical, relentless American advance across the Pacific that Japanese forces could only delay, never stop. The Guadalcanal campaign became a grinding, attritional battle where Japan simply couldn't replace its losses as fast as America. The naval battles around Guadalcanal, there were 7 major engagements, showed a clear pattern. Even when Japan won tactical victories, they lost strategically because they couldn't sustain their losses. Japanese destroyers would race down the slot at night to deliver supplies and troops to Guadalcanal, avoiding American air power. But American radar technology was advancing rapidly, giving U.S. ships the ability to detect and engage Japanese forces in darkness. The technological edge Japan had enjoyed was disappearing. By 1943, the pattern was clear. American forces would bypass heavily defended islands, letting them wither on the vine, while seizing lightly defended positions, building airfields, and moving inexorably closer to Japan. Each new base meant American aircraft could range further. Each step forward put more of Japan's defensive perimeter within reach. For Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands, the experience was psychologically devastating. They would watch American fleets sail past, untouchable, while they slowly starved. No reinforcements came. No supplies arrived. The rising sun flag still flew, but they were already dead. They just hadn't finished dying yet. By 1944, Japanese soldiers defending Pacific Islands had developed a particular dread of American naval bombardment. They called it various names: the Steel Typhoon, the Iron Rain, the Devil's Thunder. But the experience was always the same: overwhelming, relentless, and inescapable. Here's what a naval bombardment meant for Japanese defenders. First came the cruisers and battleships, firing shells that weighed hundreds or even thousands of pounds. These weren't precision weapons. They were area saturation. The goal was to destroy everything in a target zone. Bunkers collapsed, trenches caved in, the earth itself seemed to shake apart. One Japanese soldier on Peleliu described it. The bombardment began at dawn and didn't stop. We couldn't hear each other even when screaming. Men went mad from the noise. Our positions collapsed. We tried to dig deeper, but the shells found us anyway. When it finally stopped and we looked outside, the island had changed shape. Hills were gone, trees had vanished, everything was craters and smoke. But the bombardment was just the beginning. Once the Marines or Army hit the beach, the naval guns provided continuous fire support. Japanese counterattacks were met with devastating naval gunfire that could be called in within minutes. Artillery positions were targeted and destroyed before they could fire more than a few rounds. At Iwo Jima, the naval bombardment was supposed to last 3 days, but was cut to 2 due to weather. Even so, American ships fired over 14,000 shells at the tiny island before the first Marine set foot on the beach. Japanese defenders who survived described emerging from their caves to find the landscape transformed into something from another planet, nothing but craters and shattered concrete. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than the physical destruction. Japanese soldiers knew the bombardment would come. They knew it would be terrible. They knew many wouldn't survive. and they knew there was nothing they could do to stop it. You couldn't shoot back at battleships miles offshore. You couldn't counterattack a fleet. You could only endure, and most didn't. At Okinawa, the naval bombardment reached its peak. For 82 days, American ships maintained continuous fire support for ground forces. Japanese positions were pounded day and night. The battleship USS Tennessee alone fired over 6,000 shells during the campaign. That's an average of 73 shells per day, every day, for nearly 3 months. Japanese defenders on Okinawa developed a particular terror of the American battleships. When those 16-inch guns fired, the shells sounded like freight trains passing overhead. The explosions could be felt miles away. Entire hillsides were carved away by repeated bombardment. Cave systems that had taken months to dig were collapsed in hours. But what truly broke Japanese morale wasn't just the firepower, it was the certainty. Once Japanese soldiers saw American ships on the horizon, they knew with absolute certainty what would happen next. The ships would bombard their positions. Then the landing craft would come. Then the Americans would advance with overwhelming firepower support. And there was nothing Japanese forces could do to change this outcome. This psychological certainty was devastating. Japanese military culture emphasized fighting spirit, willpower, and determination. But how do you maintain fighting spirit when you know mathematically and absolutely that you cannot win? When you've seen island after island fall? When you've heard the stories from survivors of what American naval firepower can do? By 1945, Japanese defensive doctrine had changed completely. Early in the war, Japanese forces would defend the beaches, trying to destroy the invasion force as it landed. But American naval gunfire made beach defense suicidal. So Japanese forces retreated inland into caves and fortified positions, hoping to make the Americans pay in blood for every foot of ground. But even this didn't work against American naval power. The ships simply adjusted their fire inland. Cave entrances were targeted, ammunition dumps were destroyed, supply lines were interdicted, and the bombardment never stopped. At Okinawa, Japanese soldiers began to realize something even more terrifying than the naval guns. The ships represented something unstoppable. They weren't just weapons, they were symbols of American industrial might. Every day, Japanese soldiers could see new ships arriving, more supplies, more ammunition, more reinforcements. The American fleet seemed infinite. Meanwhile, Japanese forces on Okinawa were receiving nothing. No supplies, no reinforcements, no hope. The Yamato, Japan's great super battleship, had been sent on a suicide mission to Okinawa and was sunk by American carrier aircraft before it even reached the island. The once mighty Japanese Navy couldn't even get a single ship through to support its own ground forces. The kamikazes, suicide pilots, were Japan's desperate attempt to counter American naval supremacy, and they did inflict damage. At Okinawa, kamikaze attacks sank 36 American ships and damaged hundreds more. But it wasn't enough. For every ship sunk, America had 10 more. For every kamikaze that hit its target, 10 more were shot down. The Americans had developed radar-directed anti-aircraft fire and deployed it in massive numbers. The sky around American fleets became a wall of steel that few kamikazes could penetrate. Japanese pilots knew they were flying to their deaths, and not just their deaths, but pointless deaths. They would crash their planes into American ships, and the next day, the fleet would still be there, still bombarding, still supporting the American advance. Nothing they did mattered. By the summer of 1945, Japanese soldiers feared the U.S. Navy more than anything else for one simple reason: the Navy represented inevitability. When American ships appeared on the horizon, Japanese forces knew their deaths were simply a matter of time. Days, weeks at most, but certain. Survivors' accounts from the final battles of the Pacific War are filled with this sense of doom. Not just fear of death. Soldiers can accept death, but the knowledge that their deaths would achieve nothing. That Japan had already lost, that they were dying for a cause that was already defeated. At Peleliu, a Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "The American fleet is here. I can hear the guns. We have no air support. We have no naval support. We have limited ammunition and no hope of resupply. We know what comes next. We have seen it happen on every island. The bombardment, the landing, the slow advance. We will fight, but we know we cannot win. The Navy has sealed our fate." This is why Japanese soldiers feared the U.S. Navy more than any other force, not just because of its firepower, though that was devastating, but because it represented the complete industrial and military dominance of the United States. The Soviet Army was feared, certainly, especially after Japan's defeat in Manchuria. But the Soviets were a land power in a land war. They could be fought, resisted, perhaps even stopped. The U.S. Navy couldn't be stopped. It appeared wherever it wanted. It struck with overwhelming force. It supplied American ground forces with infinite ammunition and support. And most importantly, it was everywhere. The Pacific Ocean covers 63 million square miles, and by 1945, the U.S. Navy dominated all of it. Admiral Yamamoto had been right. Japan had awakened a sleeping giant. But even Yamamoto, who had studied in America and understood its industrial capacity, probably didn't fully grasp what that would mean in practice. The U.S. Navy in the Pacific became the most powerful military force ever assembled in human history up to that point. By the war's end, the U.S. Pacific Fleet included dozens of aircraft carriers, hundreds of support ships, thousands of aircraft, and the logistical infrastructure to support operations across an ocean that covers nearly a third of the Earth's surface. Japanese soldiers who survived the war often spoke about the moment they realized Japan would lose, and for most, that moment came when they saw the American fleet. Not in some climactic battle, but simply arriving, unloading, bombarding, supporting. The routine operations of a force so massive that it could wage industrial warfare as casually as Japan had once waged island campaigns. The fear wasn't of death itself. Japanese military culture had prepared soldiers to die for the emperor. The fear was of meaninglessness, of dying in a lost cause against an enemy so powerful that your death wouldn't even slow them down. Of being a statistic in a war that was already decided. Of hearing those ships on the horizon and knowing that everything you'd fought for, everything you'd believed in, was about to be erased by overwhelming industrial force. That's why Japanese soldiers feared the U.S. Navy more than any other force in World War II, because the Navy represented something Japan couldn't match, couldn't stop, and couldn't escape. The reality that they had challenged an enemy whose power was so vast that defeat was never in doubt, only delayed. The steel typhoon came for them all, and it never stopped until Japan surrendered.